Hello cave dwellers, today is an Amiga 500 rapid repair episode. 3 filthy and broken Amiga 500s. How many can we repair?
This episode is supported by MonsterJoysticks.com. Level up your Raspberry Pi with our all-in-one arcade kit using genuine Sanwa arcade parts. And OneClickPrint.com for your photos on canvas, acrylic, gifts and more. Local craftsmen and global delivery.
Yes, it's Amiga time again, and you know I hate seeing broken Amigas. So it's an opportunity to bring 3 back to life today, and they're not just any Amiga 500s. These come from the Swindon Museum of Computing's Amiga Graveyard, a corner which I found stacked with these Amigas when I went to visit them. Now the Swindon Museum of Computing, like many museums, is completely volunteer-led. So I went there on a Saturday and enjoyed my day out. It's a small but extremely friendly museum, and I asked, what can I do to help the museum? And that's when they led me to the Amiga Graveyard and this site, these broken Amigas, and of course I immediately felt it was my duty to get them repaired and back to the museum. So that's our goal today, to look at these machines, which are all in different states as you'll see, and get them back to the Swindon Museum of Computing so that they can exhibit them, sell them to raise funds, or just store them until a future exhibition. Whatever it is they need to do, they need them to be working. So this is going to be slightly different to a normal episode on my channel. It's going to be more of a rapid episode because we've got a lot to get through to repair 3 machines, to look at them, to diagnose them and answer the question, can we save all of the Amigas? Let's find out.
Amigas, is there anything better than a table full of them? Well yes, a table full of working Amigas would be a whole lot better, so let's see what we can do about that. The computers are supplied with no peripherals, so I'm using a known good power supply to test them, and we'll start by inspecting each machine and deciding how best to approach each one based on the symptoms we find. And this is Amiga 1. It's a revision 5 board with something nasty lurking in the trapdoor expansion slot. This is a 512K memory expansion with a real-time clock battery, and a battery which has given up on life and deposited its little battery guts all over the board. Yes, it's nasty, but the beauty of the 500 is that the damage is isolated to the expansion card. Only in very extreme cases does the leakage and resulting corrosion work through the expansion port into the main board. This is a very different story if you have a 500 Plus model in which the battery is on the system board, and the results of a leak there can be quite damaging. There are no visual problems with the capacitors or unseated chips, so I put some power into the board to see what happens. And, well, that's not good. We either have a problem with the video circuit, and common faults there are 2 capacitors and 2 resistors in the area, or perhaps it's the custom video chip, Denise, or something deeper. Maybe the ROM has failed. So these are the areas I think we'll start in with our investigations. Let's see the condition of Amiga number 2. Starting in the trapdoor again, this time we have a much more well-behaved memory and real-time clock expansion card. We may well service this and put it back into use, but I'll put it to one side for now to simplify troubleshooting. This Amiga then is a revision 6A, and aside from a little dust it looks okay. I'll just have to make sure all the chips are seated correctly, and then we'll test it out to see what happens. When it comes to testing the machine, first signs are a lot more positive than the first Amiga, but it isn't all completely well here. Firstly, it fails to read a known good floppy disk, so that drive perhaps needs servicing, and then I found the keyboard doesn't work. The power and drive lights work, but no key presses are registered. This can be caused by 2 things, either the keyboard itself has failed, there's a PCB on the keyboard with the controller which may be at fault, or the keyboard membrane may be damaged. Or perhaps the odd CIA chip on the system board which manages the keyboard has a fault, and we can test that by swapping it with the even CIA chip to see if the problem follows it. I'm feeling quite positive about this one. Let's see what Amiga 3 has waiting for us. Finally, Amiga number 3. In the trapdoor here we have what looks like an official Commodore branded memory expansion. Fancy! Commodore's A501 memory expansion was encased in metal shielding, and guess what? Inside we have yet another leaking battery, and you can see it's been eating away at the board. It looks messy, but that battery is some distance away from the memory modules and traces. There's just the ground plane surrounding it, so it may be recoverable. Today we'll put it to one side and concentrate on the machine, but I will snip that battery off and neutralise the leak to try and prevent further damage until I can look at it. What we have here is another revision 6A board, and once again it's a bit dusty, but the capacitors aren't bulging and there are no visible signs of leakage, and no reason not to test it, so let's power it on. And first impressions here are very good indeed. With the RAM expansion removed, it boots up, it loads a disk and the keyboard is working. Is it going to be that easy? Well, it's not to say there won't be further issues, so this, like the others that we fix, will undergo further testing to check it doesn't fall over. Those are our 3 Amigas and our challenges today, so let's see if our diagnoses and attempts to fix them give us any success. Starting with Amiga 1, which you'll recall has problems with the garbled screen output. The beauty of socketed chips is they're so easy to pop out and replace and check if that solved the problem, and of course that's what I did with Denise and then the Kickstart ROM, but to no avail here. So I approached the problem from the video port backwards, and that resulted in a little more work than was necessary, but that wasn't such a bad thing. The A500, unlike the 600 and 1200 and other Amigas, does not have a bad reputation for capacitors. In fact, they're pretty solid and you rarely see them leaking. Nevertheless, I noticed I had the correct caps in stock, so I decided it would be prudent to swap these out and test them, and also check 2 resistors which, if at fault, can cause erratic video problems. Amigas have quite a large ground plane, so to ease removal of the caps I'm using flux and some preheating to warm the area with a hot air gun. That should stop the heat from being too quickly synced away when I'm desoldering the parts. Unsurprisingly for the tough old Amiga 500, there's no sign of leakage on the cap or the board once removed, and testing showed they were absolutely fine, so this is not our smoking gun. Our resistors also checked out fine, they should both be 4.7 ohms, and my multimeter confirmed they checked out. So while I didn't find any problems here, our Amiga did get 2 smart new capacitors. So working back, I replaced Denise again, and this still gives us a problem, but a slightly different pattern on the screen. But the breakthrough came when I next replaced the Kickstart ROM, leaving the replaced Denise in place. It was the combination of both these chips, Denise and the ROM, that needed to be replaced to win this Amiga over. Individually, those 2 chips were both broken and needed replacing, which resulted in this, the old familiar Kickstart 1.3 screen, and 2 thumbs up from me. So we replaced a faulty Denise and Kickstart ROM, and along the way unnecessarily replaced a couple of capacitors, but new caps are no bad thing. This Amiga is now ready for testing. On then to Amiga number 2, which you'll recall won't load disks and has a non-working keyboard. Funnily enough, these problems could be related. The A500 has 2 CIA or complex interface adapter chips, and these are labelled odd and even. The odd CIA manages the parallel port, keyboard, some floppy disk functions, the joystick and some mouse functions. The even also manages floppy functions, as well as the serial and some parallel port functions. If we're having both keyboard and floppy issues, then the odd CIA chip, which has some overlap for both of these devices, may well be the suspect. As we have the luxury of some spare parts though, why don't we just plug another keyboard in and see what happens? And guess what? Another keyboard works, suggesting the original either has a problem with the keyboard controller PCB, which is mounted on the keyboard itself, or a problem with the membrane. And we'll take a look at that shortly, because while this replacement works, we're missing a key, and that red power light belongs in a revision 5 Amiga, and this Rev 6 should really have a green power light. Pedantic perhaps, but we want it to be accurate for the museum. For the disk drive then, at first I thought perhaps a little maintenance would sort it out, so I stripped it down, removed it from the outer casing and gave the whole thing a good clean, paying particular attention to the read-write head which needed a good clean up, and also the worm screw here which moves the drive head back and forward and looked like it could use a little grease to keep it operating smoothly, so I cleaned off the old grease and applied new grease. Now I've skimmed through that process quite quickly because not only do we have 3 Amigas to get through, but it also, well, it didn't work on its own, but it wasn't in vain. The solution was not to service the drive alone, which it no doubt needed, but it was to also swap out the odd CIA chip as suspected, because when we did that, things started to behave a lot better. With the CIA chip swapped out and the drive serviced, our disk reading errors were solved. Let's round this Amiga off then by fixing the missing key. Number 1 is missing from the donor keyboard you may have spotted. Once inside we can fish out the mangled plunger. I don't know what's happened to this. This part has a rubber foot with a carbon coating which makes contact with the keyboard membrane below to register key presses. This is where keeping old parts around certainly pays off, because I happen to have some spare plungers, so I popped a new one in and a new spring and a spare, if slightly off colour, keycap to complete the keyboard. Then we added the keyboard controller from its original keyboard, and as if by magic we now have a full keyboard which is working and a green power light as it should be, as well as that working floppy drive. Reusing the original keyboard PCB also proves that that worked, and the problem on the original keyboard is likely the membrane, so I'll order one and then I can replenish my spare parts. But for now, Amiga 2 is up and working.
So on the face of it, we now have 3 working Amigas, 2 which needed attention and 1 which possibly just needed that trapdoor RAM expansion removing. Fingers crossed that's all it was. And here's how I tested them. First I ran Keir Fraser's SysTest software, which is freely available using the link below the video. This software lets you test everything in a really simple menu, from memory tests and checking all the keys work on the keyboard, through to audio, video and CIA chip tests. It's a really useful tool to have in your Amiga arsenal for future troubleshooting. And then to further test the machines and make sure we clocked up a good time on each one and they were fully tested, well, of course, it was time for a bit of gaming. Some Turrican 2 here I played, and then I fired each one up on Twitch.
Extended testing turned out to be great fun. I really enjoyed spending time with you guys testing out the Amigas, and we got to revisit some old classics, but it wasn't completely problem free. Amiga 1 we found had problems with the mouse, and later when I moved the disk drive out of the way, well, it was quite obvious why. This resistor, R401, was scorched, and after a quick swap out, my mouse port was working again. And Amiga 3, the one we simply took the RAM out of the expansion slot on, well, that did have some surprises for us. An occasional Guru error on cold boot, although it did work fine after the error. And after a bit of head scratching, eventually we replaced the Kickstart ROM, and it has been behaving for me ever since.
All that remains is to wipe them down, load up the car and take them back to the museum, where they can decide if they want to refurbish them to exhibition standards, whether they want to retrobrite them. I don't know what the museum's stance is on retrobriting, whether they favour it or disapprove of it. That's their decision to make. Today was purely a technical video to get the machines back up and running. So if you're ever in the area, do check out the Swindon Museum of Computing. There's lots of hidden gems there. It's a small but really friendly museum. The volunteers are great to chat to there. Who knows, maybe you'll see one of our Amigas on display and you can enjoy it rather than it festering in a corner in the Amiga graveyard. As always, thank you for watching. Thank you to the museum for letting me work on these, and to all those volunteers who make the museum possible. I really did enjoy when I came to visit, and no doubt I'll be visiting lots more in future. Thanks everyone, take care, see you next time.
If you enjoy my content and would like to toss a coin into the hat to support the cave, then check out patreon.com/retromancave and join the official cave dwellers you can see on the screen now. Thank you for your support.